Right, colleagues, I would like to welcome all of you to this session, How Trauma Informs Love. It is such an inspiring moment to see that all of you are joining month after month, spending this time with me. I feel so deeply honored. As I was preparing and waiting, I saw many of you were waiting even 10 minutes before. That makes me feel so happy that there are many of us um, who are interested in learning about who we truly are, our construct, and learning about what is happening in our body, what is happening in our mind, what is happening in our emotion and energy, and what does that really mean, not just only for ourselves, but our loved ones and also our clients. And it's such a beautiful, wonderful moment. So I welcome all of you to this session and also wish you all a happy month of June. Can you believe it had been 5 sessions since we started today? This engagement, and I am so happy and honored to see many of you are still joining and being here. I really very much appreciate your presence here. And I also would like to say, as many of you send me emails, messages, and also the feedback that you provide, how useful this information, the knowledge, and these sessions that we are having. I invite you to invite anyone, not just only professional coaches, other practitioners. I would like to request you to invite anyone else that you could think of who could benefit from these sessions. And as also you are aware, all of these sessions are recorded and made available to you through the e-learning platform. I know that I see that many of you go back and re-watch the sessions. Therefore, if anyone would like to join, they can always catch up with those past sessions and join us. So let's continue on this topic. Thank you very much for being here once again. Right, so how trauma informs love. This is our topic. As you're aware, when I'm sharing my screen, I only see myself, so feel free to send anything that you may want to share in the chat room. All right, how trauma informs love, and we keep circling back to this topic at the end of each session, and I'm very excited for that possibility today as well. And I remember even during the very first session I had, some of you were already asking, how is trauma stored in the body? How is trauma stored in us? This kind of question. So now, finally, at the fifth session, we have arrived to begin to discuss this topic, the trauma imprinting. How trauma imprinting happens, what does that really mean? And also, when you provide your feedback, many of you mentioned you would like to understand this more from a coaching lens. And I think what you really mean by that is really understand how to apply this framework in coaching, or how to bring this about into your coaching. As I understand that very much, I also would like to invite you to recognize that being aware of trauma science is the foundation for you to be able to become trauma informed and bring trauma integration to your work. And although you may notice certain areas that you could potentially bring into your practice, as a professional coach, especially, I would recommend you to be very mindful how you do that. As I always mention, this is just only an introductory program to how to be informed of trauma when you work with your clients. This program, this complimentary lecture series doesn't provide you with the tangible skills to really engage with trauma, and it needs to be done in a very safe, informed space. Therefore, it's very important to be aware of trauma and recognize them and refer the client to the right professional rather than engaging trauma, as it could be re-traumatizing to the client. It could become really, it would blur the lines between operating as a coach and trauma informed or integration coach. I will definitely share with you towards the end of this series how tangibly this framework can be applied. But remember, it's only just an introduction. It requires uh, comprehensive learning, knowledge, supervision before you engage with your client. So let's keep that in mind. Now, how trauma imprinting happens and what does that really mean? So that's our topic today. And as always, I would like to mention that there will be strong topics around adversities, trauma, triggers, and mental conditions during this session. So if you are a sensitive person, please engage with caution. And also make a note, the insights, you can feel free to share your insights and any questions in the Zoom. Considering that this is not so much interactive, rather it is a lecture, I will take up your questions and then answer time to time, sometimes mostly in the lecture series itself. All right, and my colleague Lux will be sharing the registration link for the certification towards the end of the session, and share your insights with me, how these sessions create value, how your world is transforming and expanding as you gain this awareness about trauma and our human condition and human construct. As you're aware, the slides as well as the recordings will be available through the Awakened Mind Guide, our e-learning platform, which you can access later. So, as usual, let's do a very brief recap. And today in the session, I'm also going to integrate recap in between the content that I will be sharing. And I believe that now we have created some foundation of understanding trauma. Now we are at a stage we can really look deep within ourselves and also hear certain things that your clients were telling you earlier that you did not have the capacity to hear. So during this session, I believe we will open up many new doors and you will elevate, expand your listening and noticing things that perhaps you have never noticed before with your clients. So we remember traditional coaching frameworks usually operate here and now to the future. And the trauma-informed coaching enables you to invite the client to share about their past because you have the right knowledge when you are fully trauma-informed. When we talk about causes of trauma, you may recall it's too much, too fast, too soon. Otherwise, overwhelming experiences or experiences that were not enough for fulfilling certain needs that we have in life. Not enough most of the time for too long. These are the deprivation experiences. Often we do not count them in as adverse or traumatic experiences. But now you know more than ever how important those experiences are in shaping our current reality. And you remember that we have been discussing about trauma responses. And this is really very primary stage of understanding trauma responses. And that's also why I mentioned earlier, if you are curious about how this framework is applied in actual real world coaching, knowing trauma responses. At this stage, we only are scratching the surface. You might feel like you are expanding your knowledge, but at the same time, please know that is very limited. For an example, at the end of this session today, you will realize if you thought you knew about trauma responses, how further we will just go within this brief introduction that will happen within about 90 minutes. And you yourself will see how much expansion needs to take place before we actually work with our clients. Right, so you may recall a traumatic experience. We came across a traumatic experience, and later, when there's a similar trigger, similar situation, we have a specific response to it. And if you recall, earlier we discussed about many different types of trauma responses very briefly, which we will continue to discuss. And then when I did a very brief introduction to stressor-related disorders, especially the disorders that deal with, for an example, post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress, we noticed that there's a specific set of trauma responses, which are often considered as the diagnostic criteria that tell a clinician that this specific person is suffering from this specific condition. Now, today we are going to go beyond diagnostic criteria, way beyond diagnostic criteria. We are going to bring that beyond the clinical realm, truly understanding how our past experiences, especially overwhelming and depriving experiences, have shaped our reality. I promise we will go way beyond what we already know about trauma responses and the simple understanding of diagnostic criteria of certain stressor-related disorders. And as now I have been mentioning, the trauma, this specific part, the trauma imprinting, we need to understand before we discuss trauma imprinting, the nature, the relational, developmental, social, collective, event specific, special classifications of trauma, so that we have a good foundation in order for us to understand what trauma imprinting means. And when we gain this awareness, when we have this deep awareness, we are able to invite the client to discuss their past, not necessarily intervene or provide therapeutic care to clients, but provide the right space for the client to reflect, recognize, and then, if necessary, refer the client to the right professional and provide the post-traumatic growth care for the client. That's the key undertaking of a trauma-informed professional coach. And beyond that, trauma integration professional coaches are able to work with clients, acute regulation mostly, right then and there, not necessarily providing clinical or therapeutic care. We need to be very careful around these boundaries. Mentioned many times when I noticed that there's a um, limited amount of knowledge, comprehensive trauma-informed framework. I created CTICC, Comprehensive Trauma-Informed Coaching Competency Framework, and I'm continuing to evolve as I speak. Thank you for sharing that with me. So you are aware it is directly aligned with the ICF competency framework, except for one last, which is the foundational knowledge of trauma and trauma-related disorders. And greatly, we are doing it at this point as we speak. So if you would like to understand how the ICF core competency framework directly correlates with the CTICC framework, if you notice, the fourth competency is cultivates trust and safety when it comes to ICF core competency. And here cultivates trauma-sensitive trust and safety. And we are still focusing on the competency number 4.5, which is trauma-informed psychoeducation, offers information on trauma responses, triggers, aftermath. So today we are particularly going to discuss about aftermath of trauma to help clients understand and normalize their experiences. If we are to provide psychoeducation to our clients outside of coaching sessions, right? Outside of coaching sessions, trauma-informed coaches use directive approach outside of coaching sessions. If we are to provide psychoeducation to our clients, we need to have an in-depth psychoeducation to begin with. And as I mentioned, keep on mentioning, this is the scratching of the surface of gaining that right trauma-informed psychoeducation. And today, however, we are going to expand our knowledge. Let's begin with the reflection as usual. Now, very often I ask you during this process, what are some challenging and difficult experiences your clients are going through? What are some challenges that they find it very difficult to overcome? For an example, they commit to a lot of action, accountability, and then week after week, we notice that they do not necessarily really fully in an actionable way they commit. At the moment when they have that aha moment, when they had that breakthrough, they feel like they are committing or they claim that they commit, but we notice that they are not necessarily committing to them in an actionable way, tangible, practical way. That is one of the challenges that kept coming up in these sessions. Now, those are some of the challenges both your client and you feel in a coaching session. Now, since you keep asking me very often through the feedback, how do we apply this in coaching? Tell me more about how this relates to coaching. So here is an opportunity for you to expand your awareness. Today, I'm not just only asking what are certain non-constructive behavior that is limiting the client and that might be limiting the scope of coaching. I'm today inviting you to also think about certain constructive behaviors your clients have. You can think of your clients. Think about the most active clients, three most active clients at the moment, or five most active clients. As you may notice some challenges that they experience, you may also notice certain qualities that you really admire, that are really very serving for the client, very constructive, helpful for the client. Think about some of those behaviors, some of those aspects as well today. Feel free to either make a mental note or just sketch on a paper Just a few of them. And later we will address them. They will show up towards the end. All right. So we are talking about trauma imprinting. One of the reasons why I decided to use this image of cage is because imprinting sounds like somewhat implied, somewhat permanent in some ways. And that's also the connotation that we get when we hear the word imprinted. That behavior is imprinted in that person. In my language, there's a saying, um, almost like something imprinted in a stone. I think it's a proverb that many traditions, cultures, and languages have. Something is imprinted in the stone, cannot be changed. The word imprint comes with some permanence to it. Not 100% accurate, but it gives us a sense or connotation of permanence. Therefore, I thought we'll begin with this image just to remember that the word imprinting sounds like somewhat permanence. And let's find out if it is the case. Right. So before we really discuss trauma imprinting in depth, I think it's important that we re-look at trauma responses and then compare it with trauma imprints. Because I also believe very often there's a misconception in the general public that trauma responses equals trauma imprint. In fact, they're absolutely not. They're very different. And it's very important that we understand. And also, very often, if you are not fully trained as a trauma-informed coach, you might think that most of the time, what you would be listening to is the trauma responses. And in fact, most of the time, that's what clinicians do. Clinicians often listen to trauma responses. That's the pathway to diagnosis. But you, as a professional coach, more than listening to trauma responses, you will be listening to trauma imprints because the clients you work with are not necessarily clients who are diagnosed with CPTSD, a stressor-related disorder like anxiety disorder, maybe specific mood disorder. You're working with clients, those who are so-called individuals in a healthy mental, quote and unquote, healthy mental emotional range. We say we as professional coaches work with healthy individuals. It's very true. And at the same time, then we also have the question, why do we need to get trauma involved? If you had that question ever, today that question will be answered. Right. So when we look at trauma responses, you have come to learn through these sessions and also your knowledge, an immediate or delayed protective response, reaction to adversity is what we call a trauma response. And we have been discussing about few classic trauma responses, like for an example, dissociation, people-pleasing behavior, panicking, over-worrying, isolation. This we have discussed already. This we are aware of. And based on your current knowledge, perhaps you are listening to these with your clients already. Perhaps you are not necessarily engaging, but these are starting to surface. While, in fact, some of these might surface during your coaching conversations, do you know what? Actually, what surfaces most in coaching conversations is trauma imprinting. And very often, some of the challenges that we say that our clients find it difficult to overcome are actual trauma imprints rather than trauma responses. So let's explore further. Remember how the nervous system responded when the trigger was present? There was a dog attack as a child. There was the fear of the dog. And later on, when there was a dog in the similar distance or the vicinity, the person went into this specific response. And we learned that it is unconscious. The person knows I do not have to be afraid of this little dog, but I still go into this panic mode. I go into this freeze mode. And that we learned as the trauma response, fear of the dog. What happens when that fear of the dog is kicked in our body is what we call the trauma response. That's a response. But in reality, It goes way beyond than being triggered because there was simply a pet dog around us. That's not really the problem. If we thought that I got scared as a child of a dog, so now I have that same fear when I see a pet dog, this is problematic. Indeed, it can be problematic. But in reality, when we talk about deeper trauma science, that's not the real problem. Can you guess what the real problem is? One of the ways to interpret trauma imprinting is really understanding what what happens beyond the specific trigger and the trauma response. So we have an event, we have a trigger, and then there's a response to it. And this response is unconscious. And that's what we thought is problematic. But when you learn trauma imprinting, you realize that's just only a small percentage of the problem. So let's understand trauma imprinting now. So this is the lasting psychological, relational, somatic, behavioral adaptations that emerge when an experience remains insufficiently integrated. That means something happened to us. The dog attacked us and we didn't do anything about it. Now, this is not only affecting us later that we see the dog and then we got afraid of it, we got scared of it, we went into some kind of a freeze. That's not the only thing that happens. There's a psychological change that happened to you, and that is a lasting change. And that also creates a relational change in you, that creates a somatic, which means the body focused change in you, and creates new behavioral adaptation beyond being afraid of dogs. And the interesting thing is that since this is an enduring adaptation, it impacts our beliefs, relational patterns, and most importantly, our identity structure. And then we go into specific bodily patterns. Simply speaking, sometimes when someone's speaking to us, when we are not getting the things the way we want, we lose temper. We would never ever necessarily connect that to what happened to us as a child. But that is the unconscious part. That is what we are not aware. So very often when we focus on trauma responses are mostly the key symptoms. Like for an example, someone cannot sleep. Someone keep on ruminating about that same very thought. Someone feels so sad. Someone is impaired. They are unable to do their day-to-day work. Now, these are all mostly trauma responses. These are the mostly diagnostic criteria of trauma-related, stressor-related disorders. But in reality, when a traumatic experience took place, if it was not properly integrated, what happens is we directly affect our adaptation patterns, our belief system, our relational patterning, our identity structure, how our body responds to things. So the traumatic experience quietly, unconsciously shapes us to be who we are. In other words, it makes us to be it becomes our way of being. It becomes our way of being. It's not just about being triggered and react to a specific situation. It's about us unknowingly becoming someone as a result of that experience. I'm not necessarily saying it's bad or good. That's not the point. The point is that beyond the traumatic experience, the event itself, the trigger itself, and what happens when the trigger is present visibly, tangibly, we subtly have become someone without our realization, without our full permission. And this is what we call trauma imprinting. So your world expanded now. So as a professional coach, if you thought you're going to be listening to trauma responses, now you immediately realize your work expands way beyond just listening to clients' trauma responses. So remember the example of trauma response that we are just talking about, dog attack, fear of the dog. But after this experience, the person in the long run has established an imprint, which is unpredictability is dangerous. This cannot be 100% sure. I'm not saying this 100% sure. The way how the trauma imprinting works depends on person to person. But this is one potential example. Unpredictability is dangerous. Let's think about us, some of us as professional coaches. You took a coach specific education. You did a training, you did business training, and then you perhaps even created your website. But it's so very difficult for some of us to really put ourselves out there, to really go from where we are to establishing our coaching business. Maybe making that one phone call, maybe taking that one step to open your own office. It's so difficult. Why? Because when we go from our comfort zone to a space that we are unaware, there's a lot of unpredictability. Now, that unpredictability often feels like a threat, feels like danger, and you might not be able to recall a similar experience. Maybe your coaching business is your very first attempt for entrepreneurship, but you find it so difficult. You have never failed as an entrepreneur, perhaps. You have never had a major failure in life. Maybe you were successful in all your education, successful in all your professional capacity. But you keep asking yourself, why is it very difficult for me to make that one phone call, for me to go out there and truly live my best life? And you might not even connect that challenge, that apprehension with trauma to begin with. You might think that's the way I am. And in fact, that's the way we are, because we do not recognize that an imprint had been created through various experiences. It doesn't necessarily directly point to just one specific thing. And if you recall my words, I have been saying it's not just about event, trigger, and trauma response is what trauma is about. Trauma is truly about who you are becoming. What is your identity? How you are structuring your identity. In other words, sense of self, your ego. Now, if you thought few sessions before, why Fernando is going around and round and round talking about sense of self, how DNA is connected, how associations are connected, how our experiences are connected to who we are as a sense of self. It's now becoming clear to you, I believe, because the trauma imprinting, what happens to us in the past, is what forms us, what structures our ego, our sense of self, our character, our identity. Therefore, certain things that we say that we are not that type, we are not this type, I like, I dislike, I prefer, I don't prefer, I'm afraid I am not. These are all somewhat experiences shaping us. The technical word that we can use here is trauma imprinting, just to begin with, because we are approaching this subject from a trauma perspective. As of now, I would use the word trauma imprinting. But towards the end, I would like to introduce new vocabulary to you to see trauma from a different lens moving forward. So it's true that the dog attack created the fear of the dog, which is the response, but in reality, a lot more changed in you. You don't even know, you're not even aware, which could be interpreted as unpredictability is dangerous. Imprinting is created. So common trauma imprints your clients might experience or express are, I'm not enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough. People cannot be trusted. The world is a bad place. I hear even professional coaches saying, yeah, I understand the world is a bad place. People cannot be trusted these days. AI cannot be trusted this. I'm not saying that we definitively can, any of these things. But I'm asking us to weigh, where do we lean more towards? Have we ever thought, why do we lean more towards that? I must stay in control. If I didn't do this, no one would. And very often, if you're familiar with Karpman drama triangle, We have those places that we go to. We go to victim place, we go to rescuer place, and then we also go to the prosecutor place. How were these places created? How was the drama triangle created? And we have perfectionism. You're all very good at the work that you do. But when you are to write an article, when you are to open your camera and speak, we find it very difficult. We make one small mistake, we redo it. We read through our great idea. After reading, it feels like it's no longer great. Hyper independence sometimes. Some of us do not trust anyone. I have to do it myself. And some of us work very hard to make everyone around us happy at the cost of our own sanity. And when I say us, we also know that over 70% of people have experienced a traumatic event. And this is not my information. This is the information that comes from the WHO. So I believe that it is fair to say us as well as our clients. And also, before we continue on to learning about trauma imprints, it's also important to really look at it from a little bit of very simple clinical lens, the disorders lens as well, trauma-related or stressor-related disorders lens as well. So I would like us to look at trauma-related disorders versus trauma imprints. Trauma-related disorders usually comply with the diagnostic framework. We are able to recognize, all right, you have this A, B, C, D, perhaps comorbid with X, Y, Z. So that would mean for a clinician, I can make a legal diagnostic and say that you have PTSD or you have CPTSD or you have major depressive disorder or you have anxiety disorder. We can do that because we look at the specific symptom very often, which is a direct or delayed, immediate or delayed response to the specific traumatic event or events. Therefore, it goes under a diagnostic framework. However, trauma imprints in comparison is an adaptive framework. The impairment might not necessarily be visible. The impairments might not cluster together in such a way that it can go under a diagnostic framework to say that you have this specific disorder. So if you were wondering earlier, why trauma-informed coaching when we have psychotherapists, when we have psychologists, when we have psychiatrists, why trauma-informed coaching? So you're starting to now recognize loud and clear the psychotherapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, they work with individuals, those who are impaired, very clear frameworks that appears as aftermath of trauma, that appear as trauma responses. But in reality, the traumatic experiences create deeper imprints that change the way of being. They are adaptive frameworks. They do not necessarily fully go within and to fit within diagnostic frameworks. And most people that you will be working with, those who believe are healthy individuals, in fact, are healthy individuals, deal with a lot of adaptive frameworks which will not be recognized under diagnostic frameworks. So you are starting to recognize your work goes even beyond just the clinical framework of diagnostics. Your work is nuanced. Your work requires no diagnosis. I think it's beautiful in itself. You have a more attuned ear to the client. You are not just only focusing on what is the problem with the client. You are not just looking with what is the impairment. You are looking at who have you become. When I say that, do you recall this famous saying, coach the person, not the problem? Do you recognize how in depth the trauma-informed coaching is inviting you to work with the autonomy of the client? Not just with the problem and the impairment, that the psychotherapist, psychologist will take care of. Our work is more nuanced. We focus on deep client autonomy, the true expansion beyond diagnostic criteria, diagnosis, or just disorders. Our work is way more essenced and nuanced because we are able to work with the client from a perspective of who have you become? Why have you become? What does that mean? How would you like to evolve? As we discussed, usually under trauma-related disorders, it's symptoms and the impairment is the focus. In trauma imprints, the focus is adaptations. How did you adapt? And our focus is how did you unconsciously form your identity? Who did you become as part of that adaptation? You now clearly see the difference between the therapeutic work and the nuanced, true, deep, in-depth coaching work. And trauma-related disorders, we already discussed ASD, PTSD, CPTSD, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and other stress-related disorders. But in trauma imprinting, we talk about identity, relational aspects, somatic patterns, and this requires no direct impairment as such. And trauma disorders require clinical diagnosis. But trauma imprints invite us to a human development lens. Do you notice now this framework is starting to sound more and more towards coaching rather than just the clinical or the therapeutic frameworks? And trauma-related disorders are often visible. There's often visible distress. And that's why patients, clients go to a therapist, clinician. However, trauma imprints are hidden with normal functioning. If you remember, we discussed the subclinical level. It doesn't necessarily qualify for a clinical diagnosis. In fact, sometimes there is no any specific symptom as such. They are nuanced. So trauma disorders, trauma-related disorders are addressed in primarily mental health settings, and trauma imprints frequently encountered in coaching because it's who they have become rather than what are they struggling with. So the implication in coaching is many coaching clients may present with trauma imprints rather than diagnosable trauma disorders. So see, if you have been wondering, if you had a doubt, what is Fernando doing? What is this CTICC framework? Are we crossing a boundary? Now you're becoming very clearly aware. The deepest work that you intended to do, coaching the whole person, instead of the problem, coach the person and work with the client autonomy. You're starting to recognize that that is where our attention goes. It's not about diagnosable trauma disorders that we need to pay attention to. That is the job of the psychotherapist and the clinicians. Our focus is the true autonomy of the person, true essence of the sense of self of the person, and enabling the expansion through that. Because many of our clients represent themselves with trauma imprinting rather than just the trauma responses. We discussed this earlier. So I would like to introduce the CTICC trauma imprinting pathway. This is not necessarily a psychological model, scientifically studied model. This is a hypothesis for us to understand the CTICC framework through trauma imprinting. Right? So I would like to create 7 steps. So this you will not find anywhere else. This is my own creation. So this is how I would like to think about the trauma imprinting pathway. The event, the trauma responses, repeated reinforcement or non-integration, not helping them to adapt to that in a healthy way. So there comes the trauma imprint that affects identity, and that translates into behavior, which translates into life outcomes. A hypothesis. Now let's try to look at some examples to understand how the CTICC trauma imprinting pathway could be meaningful for you as a professional coach. Let's look at an example. So the event is the imprinting pathway, the starting point. The related literature, if you look at, is the trauma, stressor, exposure to what happened to us, the event itself, right? So this could be an overwhelming experience, or it could be deprivation experience. Let's look at an example. Repeated criticism. As a child, as a youngster, someone was exposed to repeated criticism. So the trauma response can be many. That person become aggressive. That person just wants to go away from that. Every time the perpetrator or the person who is providing this repeated criticism, they might want to flight, meaning go to the room, close the door perhaps, or freeze. They don't know what to do. They just sit there and wait while that person is criticizing them. Or they might have a response where they would go to phone them, please that person, work hard to make that person. The stress response systems can change. And when we learn about polyvagal theory, you will see how we move from a specific nervous system state to a different nervous system state. The example could be, like I explained, withdrawal, feeling disappointed because we've experienced shame because of this repeated criticism that we are receiving. Feeling of shame. It could go in many ways, like freezing, going to the room and closing the door, or becoming aggressive, or withdrawing, being disappointment. And what if this reinforced over and over again? What if this person, let's say it's your client, what if that person had no opportunity to integrate it? They did not have the right psychoeducation. They did not understand what happened to them. They did not create the right memory consolidation around what happened. They did not realize that there's a trauma integration. They did not come across any therapy or coaching. They did not have the opportunity to co-regulate. Therefore, the criticism continued, so it reinforced over and over again. So there comes the trauma imprint. The self-schema changed. What you believe as who you are, the identity. Implicit memory. Implicit memory is that we don't recall directly what was the incident. Why do I behave like that? Implicit. Implicit means that maybe it happened to us as a child. We did not have the right construct yet for meaning making yet. We did not have the right language. We did not have the right vocabulary. It happened to us before we were able to form and understand the frameworks that we live within our environment. You may recall in one of the sessions I mentioned that sometimes our love language is criticism. Now imagine doing that to a child. The child is able to read the expression. The child is able to feel unsafety. The child has no framework to understand that my mom's or my dad's or someone in my family, their love language is criticism. Their love language is some sort of, let's say, borderline bullying, messing with the child. So this is what we call implicit memory. They cannot necessarily pinpoint to a specific situation and say, this is where this specific imprint was created. But the imprint is feeling like I am not enough. It's not necessarily repeated criticism directly leads to the imprint, I am not enough. Don't get me wrong. It's one possible outcome. In fact, very often, the outcome is not that directly recognizable. And often, the outcome is a mixture of a lot of imprints rather than just one. But in this case, to simplify it, the imprint, let's think about the imprint as I am not enough. The identity that they create, the inner schema, right? The inner belief system is I am not enough. Therefore, in order for us to become enough, I need to embody a behavior that comes across as the perfectionist. When I'm the perfectionist, when I have felt like I'm not enough for whatever the reasons I might not remember, I must get every word 100% accurate. I must be as good as a native English speaker before I make that video. I must only deliver coaching after I have my PCC, after I have my ACC, or even perhaps after I have my MCC. The perfectionist. In my relationship, my partner is not treating me the right way. My partner told me that this one thing, therefore, my partner is not worthy of love, or I am not worthy of love. My partner must hate me. I prepared this entire dinner, just one dish didn't come as I expected. So there must be the entire dinner is ruined. I got the tickets to this specific place to go watch something, and I couldn't catch the bus in time. Therefore, my entire trip is ruined. Very often, we go into that kind of victim space without realizing why we are doing that. The behavioral adaptation is usually coping strategies. Overworking, overthinking, overcomplicating, taking too much responsibility, and so on. Why? Because the inner script, very often when you work with your clients, you work with the client's inner script. The inner script, they come across as a perfectionist. Very often we think you're a perfectionist because you want everything perfectly. Yes, it looks like it. But we sometimes fail to ask the question, where is it really coming from? It's not necessarily coming from a place of that everything must be perfect. It comes from a place of that I am not good enough. So the perfection is almost impossible to achieve. Therefore, we are limited, and that has become our identity. And the life outcome often when someone is overworking, when someone is aspiring to become a perfectionist, chronic self-doubt, burnout, procrastination, the topics that keep coming up in coaching sessions very often, as we have discussed many times. But this is not to tell you that client as a victim, the person who has perfectionism as a victim or as a problem. If we consider the client or the person as a victim, our narrative would be the client developed perfectionism because of trauma. Client feels that they are not good enough because of the adverse experiences they had. That's not our narrative. We see our clients as survivors. We see ourselves as survivors. We change our narrative. That's the most important thing. The narrative is the nervous system discovered that perfection reduced criticism, therefore reduced rejection, humiliation. Over time, that adaptive strategy became an identity imprint. We recognize that we are bound by many chains, but we do not let the chains to restrict us as much when we become aware. We have a reason why we have imposter syndrome. We recognize why we might not be. We say to our coach, we say to our supervisor, I will do this. I will implement these steps. I will do this. And we come back and the supervisor challenges, the coach challenges. And that again feels like criticism. That feels like rejection. That creates humiliation. And that might not have been necessarily your actual experience in the past. Maybe it is an implicit memory we no longer can recall where it came from, especially the deprivation experiences and how our teachers treated us growing up in school. It requires that one teacher, not all the teachers. It requires that time one of your parents was in such distress. It was that time your mother had to leave you with your grandparent who was elderly, had her own frustrations for a month. That's the implicit memory that we cannot recall. Very often we feel like, well, there were no trauma in my life as such. I can't recall adversity. You're right. Our clients are right about it. So what is important is that helping ourselves first to see our clients as survivors. It's the nervous system has discovering that when we are perfect, it could reduce criticism. It can reduce the problem that we have. It's not that we aspire to be perfectionists. We are aspiring to be less humiliated. We are aspiring to have reduce criticism. We are aspiring to be not rejected. In other words, we are seeking connection. We are seeking love, and we are seeking appreciation. And in order for us to do that, we need to slow down. We need to see ourselves as survivors rather than victims of our past. This is important. And recognizing now, perhaps it has become chronic, is because that this has become an imprint. That is the first step to change, the right psychoeducation, providing the right space. So it cannot be done if the coach's focus is goal achievement, goal achievement, goal achievement, challenging the client, more accountability, more action, more follow-up. And you notice now what it means to re-traumatize clients. I do not mean that you work with someone who is diagnosed with PTSD, CPTSD. It's out of your territory. You do not have to work with them to begin with. And that also means you're not on, we do not have, it's not that we are re-traumatizing PTSD or CPTSD diagnosed clients. We can re-traumatize clients who are healthy, those who appear fully healthy, those who have no diagnostic symptoms of PTSD, CPTSD, name any stressor-related disorder. And that's what we mean by holding space. That's what we mean. So when it comes to coaching frameworks, even the traditional coaching frameworks, there's a lot of emphasis on reflection. There's a lot of emphasis on actions, accountability, follow-up, challenge. That's all true. But there's also a lot of emphasis on co-regulation, the presence, listening, the space, taking a step back. So I believe the future of coaching is not about chasing our clients towards actions and accountability, thinking that's the way out or that's the way through. I believe really taking a step back is what really the future of coaching, because we all knowingly, unknowingly carry these imprints, whether we like it or not. Even if we did not come across any traumatic experience, adverse experiences in this life, we have discussed it earlier about intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. So we carry some of our ancestors' trauma within ourselves, whether we like it or not. Therefore, we are not only carrying the imprints of ourselves, we are carrying the imprints of our grandmothers. We are carrying the imprints of our great-great-grandfathers. Not all of us had all the means growing up. Let's say if you did, how about your mother? Perhaps they did. How about your grandfather? How about their great-great-grandfather? At somewhere down the line, we have had those imprints created and we handheld. We shared that in the hope of survival. So during our last session, I already introduced to you various types of trauma imprinting, all the way from somatic imprinting to nervous system dysregulations to neurobiological aspects to spiritual and existential aspects to attachment imprints, time distortion imprints. There's a lot of to discuss. But in order for us to go into each of this, we would need months, if not even years, to go really in depth. Therefore, I'm going to introduce 3 key types of trauma imprinting. I would like to discuss identity imprinting, relational imprinting, and somatic imprinting. And many of you asked me several times, can you please tell us how trauma is imprinted in our body physiologically? You are noticing why I did not jump into that topic quickly. In fact, even today, I'm not going to jump into that topic yet. Today, we will directly focus on identity imprints. And in our next session, I will discuss relational imprints and somatic imprints. And I promise to you, I will discuss how trauma is stored in our body as somatic imprints. This journey was necessary. Like you keep asking me, how can we bring this to the coaching? I understand your excitement. I do understand how valuable it would be. At the same time, this growth process needs to happen gradually. This growth process needs to happen thoroughly, comprehensively. And this growth process, before you go into working with your clients, need to be applied in real world situations. And you need to receive feedback. You need to receive supervision, because the work that we do is nuanced. And the more you attend these sessions, I hope the more you are recognizing how nuanced the trauma science is. Because if you come to think of it, trauma science is human science. Trauma science is your blueprint. You're starting to recognize, understand deeply who you truly are. All right, so let's continue on. So let's understand identity imprint from a psychological perspective.